in just a moment. So as we begin to prepare to turn our hearts to God's Word today, I thought I would open, as I usually do, with an introduction that kind of involves a little bit of a lighthearted question to kind of get your mind going in the right place. So this morning's lighthearted, very casual, rhetorical question is this: what are you doing with your life? Really, what are you doing with your life? Why do you make the choices that you make? How do you make decisions? How do you choose right and wrong? How do you set any kind of direction for who you want to be or how you want to live? Okay, so maybe that's really not a very lighthearted question at all. It's actually a pretty major concept for us to consider, isn't it? Why do we do the things that we do? Why do we choose what we choose? What motivates us and guides us and directs us as we navigate the complexities of this life? Now, most of you, I totally understand, can predict the churchy kind of answer here. If we are believers, having repented of our sins and turned and trusted in Jesus, then our desire should be for God to be our guide, for Him to be the why behind what we do and what we choose. The Christian life is an exercise in giving up control and leaning on the powerful and trustworthiness of God. It's a life of admitting our shortcomings and relying on God to act and to move for His glory and for our good. So believing in God means that we should desire, as David expressed in the opening psalm that we read at the beginning of our service today, Psalm 25, that we should desire for God to make known to us His ways, for Him to teach us His paths, for Him to lead us in His truth and guide us. That's what we should want. When asked what we are doing with our lives, the resounding answer for someone who loves and trusts God is that we're trying to let God lead and guide us in this. Whatever it is that we're doing, what I'm doing with my life should be a reflection of the God who I trust. And before we get into our passage today, now this is a little bit different for us, but we're gonna make a point through which we will see the passage that we're reading today. And that main point is this: that God acts in our lives by leading and guiding us. It's a simple point, but something that we need to be reminded of often, that God is a God who acts in our lives. He leads us, He guides us. He is not a distant God who does not care. He didn't set this world in motion and then turn away. No, He is a personal, powerful, involved God, and He is willing to offer us real guidance and direction for our everyday living. That's who our God is. Now, in addition to Psalm chapter 25, David also expressed this guiding relationship with God in Psalm chapter 37, verses 23 to 24, and he said this: "The steps of a man are established by the Lord when he delights in his way. Though he fall, he shall not be cast headlong, for the Lord upholds his hand." Consider this for just a moment. When we delight in the ways of God, God then establishes our steps. He is involved in the everyday doing and living, the choices that we make. He protects and redeems us as we go about our lives. He is involved, leading and guiding. Or consider Psalm chapter 31, verse 3, which says, "For you are my rock and my fortress, and for your name's sake, you lead me and guide me." This is good news for us. For the sake of His own name, our powerful God leads and protects and guides. That's what God does for those who seek Him. And as we continue looking back at the book of Acts this morning, we're going to continue to see God act by leading and guiding individuals according to His will for His own name's sake. We see this principle in action. We see God working in individuals' lives, giving them instructions, setting forth their steps, and then His name being glorified as a result. Because we understand, as we read Acts, the church would never have begun if it weren't for the leading and guiding of God, as well as the willingness of those who were being led to listen and obey. We saw just last week in Acts chapter 8 as Philip, a devoted witness for Christ, demonstrated his willingness to follow God's lead by going to Samaria, a place that was a very difficult place for him to go, a place that, as we saw, was actually consumed with darkness. And he was called to go there, and because he was called to go there, he went, he obeyed. And as we continue this morning, we're going to continue to see something really interesting. And as we do, instead of wondering what we are doing with our lives, this passage helps us to think about what he is doing with our lives. So what we're going to see is a really beautiful picture of God literally guiding the steps of an individual who is devoted to him. And even though the points that we're going to make seem a little bit disconnected and away from the passage, I think there's a way that we can read and understand the beauty of this text and then say, if I want that for me, if I want to feel God leading and guiding in my life, then what can I take from what I see here and apply to my own life? Because God is a God who acts, who leads and guides in the lives of individuals. And I want to be an individual that's guided by him. So that's how I'm going to read this passage today. Look with me at Acts chapter 8, verse 26 through the first half of verse 27. It says, "Now an angel of the Lord said to Philip, 'Rise and go toward the south to the road that goes down from Jerusalem to Gaza. This is a desert place.' And he rose and went." Pretty simple, right? As Philip's story continues, we can continue seeing him walk in faith. Now, as we saw last week, Philip had been tremendously successful in Samaria. Many people had come to faith in Jesus Christ because of his personal leadership and evangelism. But now, God is calling him elsewhere. Now, in the previous passage, we don't know how God led Philip to go to Samaria in the first place, just that Philip went there. But in this case, we see a new and different thing for Philip. God has something different in mind for him. And by what seems to be an audible voice speaking through an angel of the Lord, God audibly tells Philip the instructions. Philip heard a voice from the Lord. Now, I understand if we were to ask for a show of hands, there would not be very many of us that would say that we have heard the voice of the Lord. I mean, it's certainly possible, but I think now in our time it's a little bit more unusual. But since God seldom speaks to us in an audible voice like he did to Philip, does that mean that God is no longer in the business of leading and guiding? Certainly not. We still need God to speak to us. We need him to guide us, to give us clarity, to help us to make decisions. We need him to make our paths straight and to establish our steps. So we should understand that even though it happened differently for Philip, we can still expect God to lead and guide us because God speaks to us in a wide variety of ways. So on a quick little side note this morning, let's think about some of the ways that God does continue to speak to us, even if it's not an audible voice. Now, the first way that I think we should all agree upon is that God speaks to us through his word, the Bible. That is God's primary means of communicating with his people. And we'll discuss it more a little bit later in the message today. God also sometimes speaks to us through prayer. As we pray to God, sometimes we feel the influence of that still small voice as we quiet our hearts and direct ourselves towards God's will. God sometimes speaks to us in other ways, like by changing our desires. There are times in my life where I have wanted one thing, and then God changes my desires to want what he wants. That's a way that God speaks and he guides us. God also speaks to us very often through our circumstances. The way things work out, doors open, doors close. Through that, because we believe God is sovereign and powerful, we believe that he is speaking to us and leading and guiding us through those circumstances. Sometimes also God speaks to us through the voice of other believers. When we seek the counsel of other Christians that are like-minded and of the same heart as us, sometimes God does use other people to speak into our lives to accomplish his will. God speaks to us in a wide variety of ways. So don't feel bad if you haven't heard the audible voice of God the way that Philip did. God clearly still speaks and leads and guides us. But if you want to be able to hear and discern God's leading and guiding in your life more, I think all of us really do well to think a little bit less about how God speaks and a little bit more about how we listen. Look back at the passage, Acts chapter 8, verse 26 to 27. It says that Philip was told to go down to a particular desert road to a place called Gaza. Now, Gaza, that particular city, had been destroyed about 100 years or so before this time of Philip. And then they didn't build it back in the same place. They ended up saying, hey, if we're going to rebuild a city, let's rebuild it closer to the coast where it's nicer near the beach, right? So they moved the entire city and rebuilt it in a different place. So this road that went from Jerusalem to Gaza was not a very well-trafficked road. It wasn't a road that anybody would use anymore. That's why the verse says that this is a desert place. People don't go here. There are abandoned, deserted ruins of the old Gaza there. However, that road does go kind of in the general direction of Egypt, so people may have used it in some ways to traffic between those two places, even though that would be very, very far to go. Now, all that is to say, this was not a place that Philip wanted or needed to go. It was not on his radar whatsoever. It's deserted. The ministry of people like Philip, all throughout the book of Acts, we see these people go to populated areas, to cities where there are many people to whom they can minister and share the gospel. Why on earth would God tell Philip to go to this desert place? But as we saw, Philip doesn't question God's guidance and his leadership in this. It just says he rose and went. There was no pushback. There was no second guessing. Philip heard God's instructions and he went. And in that, I believe that we can see this. If we're trying to understand how we should listen, if we want God to guide and to lead us, we should understand this. If we want God to guide us, then we must be willing to obey. If we say that we want to see God working in our lives, that we desperately desire for him to lead us, that we want him to make his ways known to us and to teach us his paths, then we have to have hearts that are willing to actually follow those ways, that are actually willing to take those paths. Now, I know this sounds simple, but I think we all understand that this is very difficult for us to do, isn't it? I truly believe that one of the biggest reasons that we don't hear from God more often is because God knows that if he spoke to us, we probably wouldn't listen anyway. In so many cases, we've already made up our minds. Now, we may sometimes go through the motions, we may pray about it, we may ask for advice, but more often than not, we've already decided what it is that we want. It's our desires that are steering the ship. And sometimes, if we want to hear from God, we've got to put those desires aside, because his ways are not our ways. His paths are not always our paths. Why would God bother speaking when he knows that we won't do it anyway? If we desire for God to lead us and to guide us, if we want to see his hand working in our lives and acting for his glory and our good, then we have to begin with hearts that obey him. We have to begin from the position that says, God, whatever you say, I will do, even if it's ridiculous. And for Philip, the situation does turn pretty ridiculous. Look back at the passage, picking up at the second half of verse 27 through verse 29. It says, and there was an Ethiopian, a eunuch, a court official of Candace, queen of the Ethiopians, who was in charge of all her treasure. He had come to Jerusalem to worship and was returning, seated in his chariot, and he was reading the prophet Isaiah. And the Spirit said to Philip, go over and join this chariot. So following and obeying God's command, Philip is on an unused road to a deserted place, and who does he run into? Well, an Ethiopian treasurer for an African queen, of course. Everybody could have guessed that, right? No, this is not a normal Tuesday for Philip. Understand, this is a bizarre occurrence. While it wasn't maybe unheard of to meet an African person, it certainly wasn't a common thing for most Greeks. The word Ethiopian, we should understand, does not mean that this person was from the country of Ethiopia. That country did not exist yet. Ethiopian is a descriptor. It actually means man of burnt face. And I know that can sound kind of offensive, but it's not. It was just a descriptor to say he had really, really dark skin. He was a dark-skinned person, and that means that he was from probably sub-Saharan Africa. Now, at this time and in this place, the regions below Egypt were basically considered to be the edge of the known world for the Greeks. People hadn't traveled that far. It was a really difficult place to go. So they really didn't know a ton about these people in the area that was probably called Nubia. That's where he came from. So he had come a really long way, probably upwards of 500 miles to go to Jerusalem. And in all of this, this particular man, it says, was a eunuch, meaning that he was most likely castrated, probably because of his close relationship with the queen. And his role in his kingdom is basically to be the secretary of the treasurer. Now, in these African kingdoms at this time, the king was established almost like a deity, so he ran the country more in a broad sense that people revered him in that way, and it was the queen that actually had to be like the one who runs the country. She was the one running the business. So it's for that reason that he is the treasurer that answers to the queen, because she is the one that runs the whole country, the whole kingdom that he's a part of. Now, we should also understand as we read this, just as a little side note, that her name is not Candace. Candace is actually a Greek transliteration of the Nubian word for queen. So Luke is basically defining it himself. He says Candace, which is how they would kind of say the Nubian word for queen, and then he says queen of the Ethiopians, right? So he's saying the same thing twice. And God speaks to Philip once more, and he tells him to go up and join this man's chariot, which is probably heavily guarded. But again, Philip obeys, even though this makes very little sense to him. This is a weird day. He was not expecting to encounter this type of person. He does not know these people at all. He doesn't know if he could be killed by approaching the chariot of a person who is clearly very important. But he goes. So the next concept that I think that we can understand this morning, if we want God to guide us, is this. If we want God to guide us, then we must relinquish control. Understand this. Nothing about Philip's situation here makes any sense. There was a cultural chasm between him and the Ethiopian man that was a mile wide. But probably against his better judgment, Philip submitted himself to God's guidance. Philip, in this situation, controlled virtually nothing. But he knew that God was fully in control of all of it. Kind of brings to mind for me the really well-known proverb, Proverbs chapter 3, verses 5 to 6, which says, "Trust in the Lord with all your heart and do not lean on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make straight your paths." Now for me, no matter how many times I read that verse, it is always personally convicting to me. Lean not on my own understanding. My own understanding is all that I understand, right? That's how I usually make my choices. That's how I have to view the world and do things. How in the world am I supposed to not lean on what I understand? Well, the answer is very simply, I have to relinquish control. Sometimes that means I have to say, God, I don't understand what you're doing, but I do understand that you know what you're doing. And in this, Philip is doing exactly what he was called to do, giving up control. Do you think it ever once for a single second crossed Philip's mind that on this day, as he obeyed God's command, that he would run into an Ethiopian castrated man of high authority with tons of treasure? No, he would have never considered this. Even if he wanted to do this, there's no way he could have orchestrated this on his own. This is not a scenario that he understood. But if Philip had let his lack of understanding stop him, then he never would have seen the wondrous work of God, and that this Ethiopian eunuch was actually reading from the writings of the Jewish prophet Isaiah. Now that means that this man, from an entirely foreign, almost totally unknown culture, has been seeking the one true God. Somehow, He has heard of the God of the Jews, and it seems that he has sought to convert to Judaism by going all the way to Jerusalem to do this, even going as far as spending what was probably a pretty good chunk of money to purchase a copy of a scroll of the prophet Isaiah. Philip's understanding would have never predicted this in a million years. But here he is, with the ideal opportunity to discuss the Word of God with this completely random person. And this is how it goes. Look at verses 30 to 31. It says, so Philip ran to him and heard him reading Isaiah the prophet and asked, do you understand what you're reading? And he said, how can I unless someone guides me? And he invited Philip to come up and sit with him. I mean, could this be going any better for Philip? This is ideal. Not only is the guy already reading from Isaiah, but he also immediately welcomes Philip into his own chariot to discuss it. This is undeniably the work of God. All Philip says is like, do you even know what you're reading? The guy's like, well, come on up. Let's talk about it. Have you ever had a situation where someone was that immediately hospitable to you to discuss the Word of God? This is fantastic. And in this bizarre unfolding of events, I believe that we are also meant to notice the centrality of the Scriptures in all of this. Think about what we've read in the book of Acts so far. So many times when a believer in Christ begins to verbalize and make their case for him, what do? They quote the Old Testament Scriptures. It has happened over and over again. They bring up the Bible, the Word of God that they had up until that point. They bring up what God has said to show people what God is doing. They trust in the Word of God. And in this interaction, Philip doesn't rely on his own personal testimony. It's not about him or his story or how articulate or convincing he could be. No, this was about God and his Word. So the Word did the work here. And in that, we should be reminded of this. If we want God to lead and guide us in our lives, we should understand that if we want God to guide us, then we should trust his Word. The biggest and most central way that God continues to speak to new people and to guide those who seek him is still his written Word. So many people say they want to hear God speak, and yet they neglect to listen to what he has said. We believe that the Word of God is eternal and true. It stands as the most valuable resource for us in our daily living. God's Word is good, and we should expect it to speak into our lives all the time. So as kind of a side note this morning for our understanding, there's a couple of ways for us to understand what we mean when we say that we believe God speaks to us through his Word. There's a couple of things that we need to be very clear about how we approach God's Word in the Scriptures. First of all, when we say that we trust in his Word, it means that we believe that his Word is sufficient for us. That means that we believe that his Word is enough. What I mean by that is, as much as we would desire to hear the audible voice of God as Philip did, as much as we would desire situations where our circumstances all fall into place and everything seems so clear that we're supposed to go this way, as much as we would desire for God to put a rainbow in the sky to point us directly towards what we should do, first, we believe that his Word is enough. Even if all of those things don't happen in our lives, God's written Word is enough to bring us to faith and lead us to live the Christian life. His Word is enough. The other things are extras, but God has spoken sufficiently through the Scriptures, which is why it says in 2 Timothy chapter 3, verses 16 to 17, all Scripture is breathed out by God and profitable for teaching, for reproof, for correction, and for training in righteousness, that the man of God may be complete, equipped for every good work. His Word is enough to equip us for every good work, to make us complete. Our faith begins by his Word, and we walk in faith and live by that Word day to day. That means that all that we need to know to come to Christ and to live in a way that pleases him is here in our Bibles. It is the authoritative Word of God. All of it is profitable for teaching, meaning that it holds all that we need to know in order to grow in our relationship with him. For our everyday choices and for the big decisions of life, we need to be totally saturated in his Word because it is the primary way in which he speaks to us, in which he leads and guides us. We trust in his Word. Now, secondly, the second way that we understand that is this, that when it comes to other things that lead us and guide us, whether it is the good counsel of other people, or the still small voice that we've heard in prayer, or that giant rainbow in the sky pointing us in the right direction, whatever those feelings may be, when we feel like we're guided to do something, we always weigh it against God's Word. It is the filter for all of the feelings that we have to make our choices. So if we were to say, I feel like God is leading me to do this first, I would say, let's weigh that against his Word. Is it contradictory to what God has said before? Because this is what we understand. God is immutable. He is unchanging. He will never contradict himself. So we weigh our feelings and the way that we feel guided against his Word. So if you're out in Las Vegas and you feel like God's really leading me to put it all on black, that is not God's leading. We weigh that against God's Word and say that God probably doesn't want you to bet all of your life savings on black right now in this moment. That is not God's leading, that is your feeling. Does this make sense? We weigh the other things that lead and guide us against the written Word of God because we trust it just that much. And that's exactly what Philip does here in the story. Look back at verses 32 to 35. It says in the passage of the scripture that he was reading was this: like a sheep he was led to the slaughter, and like a lamb before its shearers is silent, so he opens not his mouth. In his humiliation, justice was denied him. Who can describe his generation? For his life is taken away from the earth. And the eunuch said to Philip, about whom, I ask you, does this prophet say this? About himself or about someone else? Then Philip opened his mouth, and beginning with this scripture, he told him the good news about Jesus. Of all the passages that this guy could have been reading, he's sitting in his chariot on his own reading Isaiah 53. Now again, we remember that he's probably reading the Greek translation of the Old Testament. That would have been the most common language that he and Philip shared. So he's reading from the Septuagint. And the passage in Isaiah 53 tells so clearly about Jesus' crucifixion and is thus the perfect passage for Philip to begin to share about the glories of Jesus. As we all know, Jesus was led like a sheep to the slaughter. He stood innocent, yet justice was denied him. He remained quiet as he was humiliated and scorned, and at the hands of sinful men, the sinless lamb was slaughtered. It is a brutal and painful passage, but it is the foundation of what we understand to be good news. Now, Philip could tell this man in full confidence that yes, all of this happened to this man Jesus. Yes, he did suffer like this. Yes, he was innocent, but suffered and died, and he did it so that we might be saved from our sins. The punishment that brought us peace was upon him, and it's by his wounds that we are healed. This is not just good news. This is the best news, and Philip is so eager to share it. And once again in this, I think we can be reminded of one more thing as we seek God's guidance for our lives. If we want God to guide us, then we should seek to glorify Jesus. Understand this, Philip was able to find himself in this situation because his life absolutely revolved around bringing glory to Jesus. Sure, this particular situation felt kind of like an easy win, like God had set up the pins just for him to knock them down. But in reality, this is just one episode of many in Philip's life, the culmination of a pattern and a practice of seeking to show Jesus to those who need him. This is what Philip has been doing. He has been seeking to glorify Jesus. That's how the situation has come to pass. So for us, if we desire to feel like God is leading us and guiding us, if we desire to see him work in amazing ways in our lives, then I think first we should start from the position of saying, well, I know God wants to glorify Jesus. So if I begin to seek to glorify Jesus in my decisions, then I know that at least I'm moving in the right direction. If we live in a way that glorifies Jesus, we'll already be on the right track. Now understand, I know that there are tons of difficult life decisions that you're going to have to make, and answers may not always be easy or clear. But in very, very many of the situations in which we struggle to make a decision, if we begin with the question, how can I glorify Jesus in this? Then we can be sure that we'll be set in the general right direction. If you want God to work in your life, then start by living with the glory of Jesus Christ as your top concern. Look back at the passage. It says in verses 36 to 38, and as they were going along the road, they came to some water, and the eunuch said, "See, here is water. What prevents me from being baptized?" And he commanded the chariot to stop, and they both went down into the water, Philip and the eunuch, and he baptized him. So quickly, this random situation has turned into a display of the great glory of God. It was the will of God that this Ethiopian eunuch come to faith and be baptized. Just thinking about his question for a second, if we were to ask, what prevented this man from being baptized? Well, I think if it were up to us in our decision-making, apart from the leading and guiding of God, we would say many things. He was from a completely different culture. He and Philip had nothing in common. They had no reason to speak about the Lord together. That's one reason he shouldn't have been baptized. Another reason would be that he's on his way, and Philip wouldn't want to interrupt somebody who's already doing something. He wouldn't want to be inconvenient, so that's another reason that he shouldn't be baptized. What else? Let's see. They probably don't speak many of the same languages together. The guy has no idea what the Bible is about, so why in the world would Philip do this? That's another reason that he shouldn't have been baptized. What did God say to all those things? Forget it. You don't understand. You follow my will, and you will see Jesus glorified. What reason could there be for this man not to be baptized? None. Because God has orchestrated this himself. However, before we move on, did anybody notice anything strange about that portion that we just read? Was there anything that you noticed was missing from that passage? Well, a keen eye would notice that verse 37 is missing. It goes from 36 to 38. Now, a lot of people see something like that, and it's a major stumbling block for them. They're like, wait a second, somebody edited my Bible, somebody took a verse out. Why would we remove a verse from the scriptures? Doesn't God say that's a bad thing? Okay, so let's understand this clearly. When you come across something like this, it is not a major stumbling block. It is a very simple explanation. Over the years, as we have found, archaeologically, more and more older and more original copies of the book of Acts, in those older copies of the book of Acts, verse 37 does not appear. So by modern biblical scholarship standards, we simply say if it's not in the oldest copies, then we cannot be confident that it's something that Luke actually wrote, just like the rest of the book of Acts. It doesn't seem to actually be authentic enough for us to keep it. So we removed it. But I know you're curious, so you'd like to know what verse 37 says. It is still included in the KJV because that's a much older translation that we use. And in that, verse 37 says, and Philip said, if thou believest with all thine heart, thou mayest. In the question of why should he be baptized, right? And it says, and he answered and said, I believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God. Now, is there anything wrong with that verse? Does that verse take anything away from the story? Does taking it away ruin the story? Nothing about this ruins anything. We're just not as confident that it was actually written by Luke, so we removed it. It's not a heretical verse, it's not a misleading verse, it's just a verse that we're not actually sure was part of the original transcript written by Luke. That's all. Now, let's finish this out with verses 39 to 40. It says, and when they came up out of the water, the Spirit of the Lord carried Philip away, And the eunuch saw him no more, and went on his way, rejoicing. But Philip found himself at Azotus, and as he passed through, he preached the gospel to all the towns until he came to Caesarea. So what is the result of this encounter? What is the outcome of Philip being led and guided by God in this moment? Much rejoicing. The Ethiopian man goes on his way rejoicing. It's great. Oh, and also the Spirit of God transports Philip to a city that's about 20 miles away. Just one of those weird details that we don't get to know all that much about. The Spirit lifted him up. It sounds like he went up into the sky and was carried over 20 miles to the city called Azotus. But that's not even highlighted here, because that's not the miracle. The miracle is that a man was saved because Philip listened and obeyed God. And what we see here is this final idea, kind of reflecting on the whole story, not just the fact that the man went down rejoicing, but the last point that I think that we should understand is this. There is great joy in being guided by God. Not only is the man who was saved rejoicing, but this entire account comes across, I'll use this one instead. This entire account comes across as something that is incredibly celebratory. It is meant to show us the amazing work of God in people's lives. No one would have predicted or foreseen any of this, and yet here it is. So this morning, if it feels really difficult for you to know if God is speaking into your life and guiding you, and if it feels like it would be a lot of work and a lot of risk to follow him and be guided by him, be reminded, there is so much joy in being guided by God. It is my joy to seek the Lord and to follow his lead, however imperfectly I may do it. Sometimes allowing God to lead and guide is exciting and fun and exhilarating. Sometimes it's peaceful. Sometimes it's even painful in some ways. But if I believe in God who loves me, who decides to work in my life for his glory and for my good, then it is always a joy for me to follow him. Because I can know for sure that God loves me enough to speak into my life, to teach me his ways, to make straight my path, to establish my steps. Because of all that, I can take joy in following as he leads. So as we close for today, I hope that you feel a desire, as I do, to feel God leading and guiding you. And I hope that we together as a church can seek his guidance, being fully willing to obey no matter what he calls us to do, feeling able to relinquish control and trust in him, turning to his word as our greatest resource, and seeking to glorify Jesus in all things. And when we know that God is at work among us, I guarantee we will celebrate with great joy. Let's pray as we close for today. God, we are thankful that you are a God who is active, who works and moves in our lives, who doesn't leave us wondering for long. But God, for all the moments that we feel that we've struggled to hear, God, help us to see that sometimes it's our hearing problem, not your speaking problem. Help us to direct our hearts to your will. Teach us your ways. Set us on your paths. Establish our steps so that we can walk in a way that glorifies your Son, Jesus Christ. God, for anyone struggling with a particular decision this morning, we do pray for you to speak, for you to be real and noticeable in their lives. And for those of us struggling with things that we just don't understand, that we don't know what to do, God, give us the comfort to know that you are in control, that you have a plan, and that you care for us. We ask all these things in your name. Amen. Let's stand and sing.